Parliament would have decided that Tobago should have its internal self-government in 1977. It stopped woefully short of giving us internal self-government.
What we have done is to look at what Tobago sent down to Trinidad versus what made its way into the current bills before the Parliament, pull out those differences, and we are going to restart the conversation by highlighting those differences.
Welcome to yet another episode of Side by Side, our road to Tobago's self-government, where we share with you the essential requirements for self-government for Tobago, the government's provisions in the both draft bills and the Advisory Council's suggested amendments to both bills. In this episode, we're talking about matters for which the Tobago legislature should have exclusive lawmaking authority over. And we're about to get this episode started with former Chief Administrator, Mr. Alan Richards. So in our last episode, Attorney at Law Ingrid Melville spoke about lawmaking authority for Tobago in its quest to achieve self-government. In this episode, we're going to be discussing matters for which the Tobago legislature has exclusive or should have exclusive lawmaking powers, and it must not be less than what is provided for in the 5th schedule of the THA Act, Chapter 25 and 3. With me is former Chief Administrator, Mr. Alan Richards. But before we delve into the details of the matters, Mr. Richards, can you just tell us again exactly what does it mean when we say lawmaking powers for Tobago?
As indicated in the last episode, any government, whether it's local, municipal, city government, needs to have some element of lawmaking authority so that it can carry out the policies that it has come up with. So that is a critical and absolutely essential element of any governmental structure. In this particular case, the Tobago House of Assembly, which would be renamed insofar as the bills before Parliament are concerned, the Tobago Island Government. There are two bills, the Constitutional Amendment Bill and the Tobago Island Government Bill, which is subordinate to the Constitutional Amendment Bill. They both have recognized the need for Tobago to have lawmaking authority. Consequently, the Constitution makes provision for the establishment of a Tobago Island Government legislature. And it's at this legislature that the bills and laws and regulations that the Assembly needs to provide for good government in Tobago would be undertaken. So far, the two bills would have made some recommendations for the items, the functions that the Assembly would be able to provide lawmaking powers for. It has, though, split the elements that the Assembly would be responsible for into two: administrative and lawmaking, full lawmaking. The Assembly and other stakeholders are of the view that we ought to have one lawmaking authority that covers also the areas that are now considered administrative elements. And consequently, that's the recommendations that's going to be made. However, while there is agreement on the general format, the items that are included and the depth of authority given in those bills are what are in question. So that's where we are. They are in the administrative element. That's currently Schedule 1 of the Tobago Island Government Bill, and there are 42 items. In the second schedule, which deals with the lawmaking authority, there are 24 items. The view is that all the items that are under the administrative level, which came essentially from the 5th schedule of the current Tobago House of Assembly Act, ought to be put under the Lawmaking Authority.
Okay, and today we're going to discuss 13 of the matters which Tobago legislature should have lawmaking powers over. So could we start with finance as the first matter?
Okay. Finance, that is included in what is now called Schedule 2 of the Tobago House of Assembly Bill. We think all those matters in Schedule 2, both Schedule 2 and Schedule 1, should be made into one schedule called the 4th Schedule of the Constitution, as distinct from having it as in the subordinate bill, in the Tobago Island Government Bill, which can easily be removed by a simple majority. Whereas if it's placed, these powers are placed in the Constitution, then there's greater difficulty to remove them and can't be removed at the whim of any government in power. What the Assembly purports ought to happen is that the legislature of the Tobago Island government should allow it to do things like determining the level of borrowing to carry out the works in order to provide for imposition of fees and some element of taxes and incentives to be able to bring business to the island, as distinct of just relegating it to doing collection of government revenue and expenditure for the Assembly. It ought to have those expanded authorities in order to be able to manage the economy of the island, so that it would be able to set economic parameters for doing different things on the island, inclusive of incentives for companies and organizations to move here, providing possible tax breaks and also perhaps subsidies, and maybe also approving areas of activities that would bring revenue into its coffers for services and other kinds of activities that an island government would be involved in.
So another matter that we're saying Tobago should have exclusive lawmaking powers for is state lands?
Yes. In the area of state lands, the law provides, and even in the previous, so in the current law, 1996,
right.
State lands fall within the ambit of the Assembly to administrate. Of course, now it doesn't have lawmaking authority, but if it has the state lands under its purview, then it has to manage it, and consequently it has to have the authority to make the necessary laws and regulations for that management. That has not been included under the current Schedule 2 that treats with areas for which the Assembly would have lawmaking authority. But it definitely would need that. And I remember in the last episode we were talking about the Book Reef.
Right, yes.
Where the Assembly sought to put in place some measures for its management and control of the activities and stuff like that for maybe over 20 years, and that has not been approved. That's a great example yeah. of the Assembly. If it had those levels of authority, could take care of that kind of problem and be proactive in that process.
Right.
So state lands is certainly one of those that ought to be under.
Right. And could we discuss a bit about museums, archives, historical sites, and historical buildings, such as the museum here at Fort King George?
Okay, so it's really fortuitous that we are here. That again is not placed under the second schedule, and consequently not under the purview of the Assembly to determine how these are managed in terms of putting in place the appropriate laws for its management. We think that's a gross oversight. Those are areas that are functionally within the assembly, both for operational and strategic management. How do you use them to bring about? Because particularly in an island where tourism is a key economic activity, and that's where people come and recreate and find ways of generating revenue. So currently, where we are, the Assembly has spent over the past 20 years lots of money developing and preserving what is here at the Fort King George, but it doesn't have the authority to charge fees. And we've spent all of this money. You would have seen how many people pass this morning, and none of them
paid an entrance fee.
Or something. You go to other territories throughout the
Caribbean, yes.
Certainly, and you would have to pay to get in there in the first place, so that we don't have the revenue earning capacity.
The maintenance of public buildings such as the residences of the Prime Minister and the President should also be listed?
Well, all public buildings fall under the Assembly for purposes of construction, the Act says. In the case of the residence of the Prime Minister and the President, the Assembly only has responsibility for maintaining them. Right? But if you are responsible for constructing them, there are codes, there are all sorts of things that are necessary.
And before we get into the break, could we just discuss tourism, sports, culture, and the arts? What's provided for these topics in the draft bills, and what is the Advisory Council suggesting?
Well, on that, and you would have thought that that's an area that the Lawmaking Authority would have been more profound, particularly since the island is dependent on tourism. And tourism is identified as one of the features of economic development nationally of the island. But consequently, all it treats with is the Assembly providing amenities. It doesn't have authority to determine in this particular bill how different activities are zoned, determined, and stuff like that. What kinds of, and this will link back to the finance aspect, in your planning, what kinds of incentives do you give to different types of organizations to come into the space and to do things that would help to generate activity and economic benefit. That is another one where the authority given to the Assembly is virtually just superficial. It doesn't go to the depth that would allow the Assembly to make the kind of transformation and to develop the industry to the point where it becomes economically viable and provide for the nation as a whole to benefit from the tourism industry. We see sports, culture, and the arts in a large measure as part of the tourism trust.
Right.
Particularly now we're talking about sports tourism and in a sense monetizing the heritage. We see it, in fact, even the phraseology in the bill, we think should change to encompass the whole idea of heritage and culture in its broader sense, that includes both the historical and the natural, that would take care of the flora, fauna, and all the different things that are related to it in terms of the stories, the folk stories, the relationship with other entities and countries.
Right.
So that culture and sports and all of these, because while we want to maintain them, largely to maintain our heritage, we also ought to, as so many other countries have done, including those countries that we consider very developed. They get a lot of their revenue out of tourism by dint of their heritage and culture.
We have to pause and take a break right now. When we return, we'll discuss matters such as community development, cooperatives, fisheries, and food production. Stay with us side by side. Our road to Tobago's self-government will be right back. What are your thoughts on Tobago's desire to achieve autonomy, Luke?
I think Tobago's autonomy is something that is needed. However, so many people, especially on a regional scale, they think that it's all about separation, about the island separated from Trinidad, when it's nothing like that. When you think about Tobago's autonomy, it is an opportunity for the island to just have greater control over the things that reflect us as Tobagonians. It is a matter where, as the island, we can now have that level of control. So, for example, if something bad was happening in Trinidad, we can now support Trinidad. When you think about having a different system, even in our legislators, to have faster approval of certain bills and those unique aspects, Davia.
I'm looking to see that Tobago is able to plan and execute to some level of dependency and not have to depend on Trinidad to do everything.
Define the boundaries of Tobago within the bill.
I just don't like how the government is handling everything so far.
One. Six. Beautiful island.
Mr. Richards, let's talk about cooperatives firstly.
Okay.
What provisions are made in the bills, and what do we suggest?
Yes, it has taken cooperatives on board in terms of one of the areas that the Assembly would have lawmaking authority for. It doesn't go far enough, we think, in terms of allowing it to legislate for the financial arrangements that need to put in place, the manner in which cooperatives can take a very active part in economic development in terms of providing the community, because they're all community-based, and that the economic development can similarly be community-based, with using the cooperatives as the financial instrument for providing funds for local entrepreneurs in the communities to do their business, and then by that very token allowing for the revolving of the funds that come into a community, spending time and turning around in that community before going back out. Because one of the issues that Tobago as a whole has is that the funds that come into the island do not, I think it's been estimated to do 1.6 turns before it goes back out of the island. So on the basis of within the island itself, we like to see more of that kind of decentralization of economic circumstances.
Can we talk about community development?
A big topic for it. Yes, well, again, in community development, I think we think a very narrow view of what community development means. In here, it just gives it authority primarily over developing the physical infrastructure, primarily just buildings and stuff like that. But community development is much, much wider than that. In fact, community development is holistic, and almost everything can be subsumed under community development. Tourism, sport, culture, finance, as we just were talking about, cooperatives. So with that broader view in perspective, if the entity that is responsible for good governance of the island has the facility to make the appropriate laws to allow it to take care of all of those things, that would be the ideal circumstance.
And lastly, food production, fisheries, agriculture. What is provided under these topics?
Again, we think that they haven't gone far enough, because in essence it is saying that you could only do things that basically fall within the ambit of the national laws. It doesn't allow for generating the kind of lawmaking regulations that would allow for changes and for initiative and for allowing the kind of transformation that would be necessary to move the island and to move those sectors into the areas of development. Particularly if we are talking fisheries, that is limited. In fact, I should have said that given the way the law is structured, particularly now in terms of the jurisdiction, the Assembly wouldn't, the island government wouldn't have any authority beyond the high water mark.
Okay.
So it wouldn't be able to deal with fisheries. It would only have authority to provide facilities on land for fisheries, because currently, in the current law, the Assembly has authority for doing stuff 6 nautical miles from the coastline. In this proposed law, it has lost that authority. It can't do anything out in the sea. So that is an absolutely retrograde step in that regard. These areas, the really real tests of what would be, and I use devolved advisedly, because as we have said at the start of this, the previous episode, that power to the people really is a reversal of the way things ought to be. It's the people who are allowing other people power over them. So when we talk about devolution, it's as though you are getting something from someone else when it's your own right.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Richards, for the information you shared with us in this episode. Viewers, that brings us to the end of this episode of Side by Side, Our Road to Tobago's Self-Government. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we hope to see you again next week as we share more details with you on the matters for which the Tobago legislature should have exclusive law-making powers for in the island's quest to achieve self-government. I'm Davia Chambers. We hope to see you again next week.